Good morning and welcome back to the Duval 22 podcast. Welcome into episode 2 with John Sheeran, who covers the Cincinnati Bengals for A to Z Sports, talking about the Jaguars at Bengals week 2 preview here. John, thank you so much for joining today. How's the season treated you so far?
So far, so good. You know, the Bengals haven't been 1-0 in 4 years, but thank you for having me on, Gus. And by the way, I always appreciate a good podcast name because there's 10,000, no, not 10 billion of them nowadays. But Duval 22 is special. It's nice.
I appreciate that. I guess I should have said on the last episode, in case you aren't aware, Duval 22 is kind of a nod to Coach's All 22 film, because what we're trying to do here on both the website duval22.com and this podcast feed is kind of diving in deep and kind of really getting in the nitty-gritty of analysis for both the team and their opponents. And that's what we're doing today, really. Although it is a Jaguars podcast, we're just trying to learn as much as we can about the opposition for this week in the Bengals home opener against the Jaguars. So, John, let's start off talking about the Bengals season opener last week in week 1. As you said, they did win the game against the Cleveland Browns, but it was pretty ugly. Yeah, quote unquote win. The Bengals had just 141 yards of offense, which is their lowest output in the Joe Burrow era. In the second half, they went 3 and out on 5 of 6 drives, and they had just 7 yards, which is the least amount of second half offensive yards by a winning team in the past 25 years. And so I'm interested in just like what your takeaways are from that game, and kind of like, is it more so based on opponent because Joe Burrow has historically struggled against the Browns, at least relative to his production against other teams, or is this a cause for genuine concern going forward?
A lot of things. I think for one, you kind of hit the nail on the head with the Browns. Jim Schwartz is obviously a really good defense coordinator. The Browns have most, if not all, the ingredients to neutralize the Bengals offense. They have obviously an elite pass rusher, the best pass rusher in the world, and Myles Garrett, who you cannot contain for 4 quarters. The Bengals did a decent job of that for about 2.5 quarters, and then kind of like the Super Bowl with Aaron Donald, eventually like he just gets going, and that's kind of what happened with Myles Garrett. Orlando Brown Jr., solid left tackle, but not even he can keep Garrett contained for 4 quarters. They have cornerbacks on the outside, Denzel Ward particularly. Greg Newsome had a really good game, but their cornerbacks are kind of built to play man coverage, and when you can go man-to-man, one-on-one with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and neutralize them better than, I would say, 95% of other cornerbacks in the league, you have the recipe for success there, because the Bengals love to attack man coverage because typically Chase and Higgins can win those matchups, but when they can't, in the 2.5-3 seconds that Burrow has in the pocket before Garrett comes screaming down at you, that's why the Bengals have struggled historically against the Browns defense. And, you know, like the Cleveland Browns, there's all those narratives in there, but they got athletes, they got talent, and they just don't have a quarterback or sustainability there to really put it all together for a full season. But the AFC North is always ugly. It's very rare for teams in these interdivisional games to really dominate one another. Sometimes it's happened at the Bengals' expense. Sometimes the Bengals have rarely done it in the Zach Taylor era. But you know, the Browns are always tricky, and I think especially I was thinking about this when watching like Bills and Ravens when they scored like 81 points. Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, they're just so physically gifted. They can do whatever they want. They can roll out of bed and just score 40 without any sort of warm up game. It's not exactly the same with Burrow. Like, his game is predicated on timing and getting into the rhythm, and sometimes it's just not there in week 1. I feel like that's where a lot of his struggles outside of just being healthy have kind of come at the start of the season. So you combine that with just the offense just not fully in sync just yet despite the preseason time, along with an opponent that knows him really well. That's kind of how you get, like you said, just an abysmal second half performance. It shouldn't be that bad, but there were signs as to why it ended up being like that.
It'll be interesting to see how much the Jaguars deploy man coverage. They were primarily a zone offense in week 1 under their new defensive coordinator, Anthony Campanile, and that was to be expected. So it'll be interesting if they kind of ramp up the man coverage usage in week 1 or in week 2 based on what you were just saying. I'm also definitely interested to see like how much pressure they apply in terms of sending extra rushers, because they were able to do a good job of that against Bryce Young and company in week 1. But obviously Joe Burrow is a different animal. I feel like he's in that class of quarterbacks that you just can't really blitz against. And so I'm assuming that the Browns were able to get home with 4 for most of the game, or did the Browns actually end up sending some heat and that kind of caused some problems for Cincinnati?
They didn't really blitz that much, and I feel like whenever you do blitz Burrow, he typically knows where the hot is, and then he can get the ball out pretty quickly. So that's typically a recipe for failure. But again, like, the Browns just have the athletes up front to rush for and eventually get home, and that's just kind of what happened against the Bengals offensive line that I think has more talent on paper than they've had in recent years. But again, it's still like you had Dalton Risner being thrown out there for the very first time as an emergency backup. He just joined the team like a week prior. He didn't barely even practice with the team. He had a rookie left guard in Dylan Fairchild. So I think there are some pieces where like maybe you throw in a delayed blitz or a stun here and they can get him all discombobulated. But typically you don't want to blitz Joe Burrow because they'll make you pay for it.
Absolutely. You mentioned the offensive line, especially with Risner entering into that right guard position. How much of a concern is the offensive line? Like certainly having Joe Burrow, who's so good at evading pressure and navigating against blitzes, he can do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of just like beating pass rushes. But how much of a concern is the offensive line in Cincinnati, especially relative to recent years?
I would say it's less concerning compared to recent years because now with Risner in there, like the whole thing was going to be how quickly would it be until they pull Lucas Patrick for Dalton Risner, who Risner just a better overall resume as a player compared to Patrick. And, you know, they had Patrick competing up against Cody Ford for right guard. And it's just like, this is an offensive line with Joe Burrow. You typically don't want to have those two as your like main options to be a starter. And that was just the plan that the Bengals foolishly had until, you know, Risner was still available in late training camp. And they realized, wow, we need some depth here. We need potential answers. And Risner was there and he wanted to join the team and everything like that. So that all worked out for them. And I think he's definitely their best guard on the team right now, but Dylan Fairchild has the potential to eventually be that. He had a promising preseason, but he had some welcome to the NFL moments against, again, some quality players up front for Cleveland. So on paper, again, I think this offensive line is the best that Joe Burrow's ever played with, but it's still, I think, going to take a handful of weeks here to really gel together, especially with a new guy in Risner who's just really just getting his feet wet. And now he's going to be practicing as a starter for the first time. But you're expecting a second-year jump out of Mamarius Mims, who was a first-round player in 2024. All the talent in the world just has to just kind of play through injuries and toughen up a bit. And I think you have two solid, stable veterans, Ted Karras at center, Orlando Brown Jr. at left tackle. So the pieces are there for this to be a really complete unit. Are they going to be top 10? I doubt it. I think there's still some athletic limitations there for the most part, but I think in terms of just a solid, stable pass protecting unit with some minimal upside in run blocking, I think this is still going to be one of the best, offensive line units that Joe Burrow has ever seen.
That makes a lot of sense. Last question on the offense before we switch sides of the ball. Just does the scheme look any different, or like the personnel or like the tendencies that they have? Are they like going under center more? Are they featuring the tight ends and the running backs more? Since the Bengals have missed the playoffs 2 years in a row, I have to imagine that Zach Taylor will be a little bit on the hot seat if they're not going to make it again this year. And so I feel like that's kind of a reason for him to adapt even more than usual. But I'm just curious if, like, I feel like every fan in the National Football League probably imagines the Bengals offense is like Joe Burrow in shotgun and then T. Higgins and Jamar Chase on either side of the formation running vertical routes. But like, what exactly does the Bengals offense look like, especially compared to recent years?
That was the formula in 2021, right? When Chase was first there and people didn't really know what to expect, and they just kind of lived in there because that's what Burrow did so well at LSU, and they still want to have that as their base. But I think what Zach doesn't get a lot of credit for, obviously he's very questionable as a situational play caller, and he definitely deserves criticism for that. But I think he also is underrated in terms of evolving as the season goes on. They had to completely change the run game a couple of years ago when they realized they couldn't run out of center and marry that with their shotgun passing game. And in the past couple of years specifically, they put Burrow in the pistol a little bit more because I still don't think he's that comfortable dropping back from under center and going under center play action, which is frankly statistically a cheat code for most quarterbacks, but for whatever reason he's just not really comfortable with it. So they put him in the pistol to still try to package some of those wide zone runs out of the pistol because you can still kind of get your blocking scheme from that alignment, but also you can set up play action that way. And it's kind of like a happy medium, I guess, where he's not fully under center, but he's not in the shotgun, if you will. But they went under center, I think, more than I expected against Cleveland. They have been trying to implement more 12 personnel. That's why Noah Fant was signed in the early parts of training camp. He actually played the second most tight end snaps ahead of Mike Gesicki, who is not really a tight end. He's basically a big wide receiver and a tight end in name only. But I think against specific matchups where like they're really concerned about the pass rush, you'll see Burrow in the pistol in 12 personnel packages a little bit more, which may be sacrificing some snaps from Andre Yosevach or maybe Mike Gesicki a little bit, but Chase and Higgins are obviously still going to be on the field. So I would expect as the season goes on in some matchups, a lot more 12 personnel than you're typically accustomed to seeing. They tried to do more of that last year when they had a rookie in Eric All Jr. take over as the second tight end, but then he got hurt, which is the whole reason why Noah Fant's here in the first place. So a little bit more tight end usage than you're probably expecting, and a little bit more of Joe Burrow in the pistol than you're expecting as well.
Gotcha. One more quick question, actually, on the offense. I'm just curious your thoughts on running back Chase Brown. He's gotten a lot of hype over the summer, especially among like the fantasy football community, and I do feel like a lot of that is like basically just based on last year's results, especially his workload after Zach Moss went down. And so do you think that, like, would you agree with that, where like a lot of that is just kind of based on last year, or is Chase Brown truly like a good player and like a weapon for this offense?
I think he is good. I think he's still got some room to grow, but I think he gets typecasted as like a smaller, change of pace back. But I think his footwork and his pad level, it makes him more effective in short yardage situations than people give him credit for. Obviously, the offensive line, I still think that's the weak point. Like, they don't get a lot of movement up front, and they're going to be, they're not always going to be reliable in those situations, especially when I really think their creativity in short yardage running situations is very minimal as well, so it's pretty easy to defend. But I think Chase Brown is more powerful than he gets credit for, and his vision is better than he gets credit for. And obviously, he's still a young player. This is really his first year as a full-time starter, but this whole run game is really predicated around his skill set, and he can run outside of the tackles, he can run in between the tackles, and he's really developed as a receiver too. So his skill set, I think, is going to be put on full display this year. Like last year, obviously, he was really good in the later part of the season, but he was kind of overworked as well, which is why he ended up getting injured in the later part of the season, which is why you'll see Samaje Perine for about 25% of the snaps. But this is Chase Brown's backfield, and I really do feel like he's going to really show his full skill set out there.
Sweet. Appreciate the insight there. Moving to the other side of the ball now, the Bengals let go of Lou Anarumo, their defensive coordinator, and brought in Al Golden from Notre Dame. I'd like to hear about like what's kind of different about the scheme from this year compared to last year, and like how much Al Golden has changed about the structure of the defense. But first, just tell me like what your reaction was to Anarumo no longer having the job, and then their decision to hire Golden.
Yeah, the whole process was, I'll say, interesting, because obviously they needed to change something after last year. You can't have the historic offensive performances and miss the playoffs and have everyone keep their jobs, right? I think Anarumo, I think he's still a really good defensive coordinator. I think he's going to do a really good job in Indianapolis. It's a shame for him that he didn't get a head coaching opportunity when he did, because I don't know if that's ever going to happen now. But he really thrived when the Bengals had a stable collection of veterans who understood the complexities of his scheme. And then the Bengals were like, oh, we have a lot of money to invest in the offense, and we can't invest that much in the defense anymore, so we have to build through the draft. And then when they drafted like 9 or 10 guys in the first 3 rounds, and like in the span of 3 consecutive drafts, those guys rarely saw the field because Anarumo didn't trust them. And then he still tried to roll out some veterans out there, and they were old and slow, and it just wasn't effective anymore. And I think he just didn't really connect with the younger players in the locker room, which is why they felt like they needed a change. And when they were locked in on Al Golden, I thought it was kind of at first a lazy hire, because he was there previously as Anarumo's linebackers coach for a couple of years before he went to Notre Dame. But then you learned that he was like best friends with Zach Taylor. He's still neighbors with him in Cincinnati. And I think it makes sense from the fact that he had so much success at the college level as a DC, connecting with younger players and really maximizing the skill sets, and maybe not the most elite athletes. You saw that against Notre Dame, Ohio State, right? Ohio State just had the advantage all across the board there, but Notre Dame kept it no pun intended, like a fighting chance for the Fighting Irish, right? So I think he makes sense as a guy that can come in and maximize the young, underdeveloped, underutilized talent that the Bengals have, because that's what needs to happen for this team to be competitive. So I think from that sense, it made sense to bring in Golden as a guy that can really just lock in on the younger guys that haven't played that much. And you saw a little bit of the results on Sunday against the Cleveland Browns. Like Jordan Battle, Demetrius Knight played pretty well, and some of the first starts of their careers. You have a defensive line that's going to be rotating 8 guys in and out throughout the game. Shamar Stewart's going to be all over the defensive line. And I think in terms of changes so far, you're going to see more blitzes compared to Anarumo. He loved to show blitz, but drop back 8. That's how he had so much success against Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen. But this time, he's not going to be afraid of sending you Demetrius Knight and Logan Wilson up the middle on some of those blitzes. A lot more man coverage, a lot more cornerbacks following guys across the formation instead of just guys being locked in on one side of the formation. But you're still going to see a lot of single high looks with Geno Stone at free safety, some cover 6 with some mixed max of zone and man across the board.
That makes a lot of sense. I kind of know of Lou Anarumo as like one of the best individual like game to game planners in the NFL on the defensive side, especially considering like the Super Bowl run that the Bengals made and their cover 8 strategy against Patrick Mahomes. But even in the regular season, he seemed to be really adaptable from game to game. So it does make sense that he kind of leaned a lot on veterans and maybe wasn't as great with younger guys. And so the Bengals did rank 25th last year in yards allowed and points allowed. Do you think that there's going to be a pretty sizable leap this year because of like Golden's ability to connect with younger players and kind of like this youth movement, or do you think it's going to take? I
think it's still going to take a little bit. Like I think it was promising how they kind of came back together in the second half against the Browns, but at the end of the day, the Browns dropped some pretty key passes, and Joe Flacco is nothing really spectacular quarterback, even though he knows what he's doing out there, and he could still throw an accurate ball. I would say that the yardage is going to be a little bit better. I don't think they're going to be as susceptible to explosive plays. I think they're just more athletic out there, and the communication has been a lot better as well. That was a huge problem with the last couple of years on defense. Guys just didn't really know their pre-snap calls and everything like that, and I think what has been a consistent messaging from the staff has been empowering players and making sure that they're on the same page and allowing them to make the adjustments as they see fit from pre-snap to post-snap. And that was on display a little bit against the Browns as well. So I think the explosive plays is going to be a little bit better. I still have some questions and concerns about this pass rush overall. There's obviously no question about who Trey Hendrickson is. He's going to get his, and apparently he just didn't need training camp to really show up. But I still need to see more from Shamar Stewart as a total pass rusher. I still need to see a jump from Joseph Asai. I just don't know who is going to be this reliable ancillary pass rusher outside of Trey Hendrickson. I thought that they didn't do quite enough in terms of building that position group in the offseason, and they're going to rely on just the development of the guys that they already have. So I still need to see more in that regard, but run defense is going to be a little bit better just because they actually have a nose tackle out there in TJ Slaton. Explosive plays are going to be down a little bit, but pass rush is I'm still a little bit weary on that.
Gotcha. You did mention 17th overall pick Shamar Stewart a few times. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on him, especially because of his contract situation. He signed pretty late in the offseason, so I think it was kind of expected that he would get off to a relatively slow start. But he did have, I believe, 3 pressures on Sunday. But you said you're still looking to see more from him. So just talk a little bit about what his impact has been so far, but what you do want to see.
Right now, my expectation is kind of who he was against the Browns. Just a guy who can just be disruptive, right? Like, you may not win cleanly, you may not be able to get to the quarterback fast, but just be like a chaos force multiplier, because that's just something the Bengals just haven't had. And there was a play against the Browns where he just crossed the face of 2 blockers. One of them was David Njoku, and he completely just disrupted the point of attack for the Browns run game. It ended up being 0 yards. He didn't make the tackle or anything like that, but just that get off the line and to create chaos in the blocking scheme, that's something the Bengals have had to deal with for their offensive line against defensive lines, but never for their own defensive line. As good of players as they had over the years, they haven't had that kind of athlete just yet. And I think that's why they want him to be on the field, to just provide chaos and allow others to make plays. And I think he showed that against the Browns. And you want to see more of that. I'm just talking about in terms of where to place his hands, his pass rushing process. Like that, I think that's still, far away, and it's going to take some time. He's still a really young player, and he was only in college for a few years now. So in terms of just winning, as a sustainable pass rusher, I still have questions there. But just to be basically a headache for offensive lines, I think he can be that, and I think that's what he was in training camp, and you did see that against the Browns for sure.
Gotcha. One last question about week 1 before we transition into kind of truly previewing week 2. Was there anything that surprised you from week 1, or that wasn't on your radar that popped up, something that you learned about the team or either side of the ball? Just something that kind of stood out that you weren't really expecting in the season opener?
I don't know if this was unexpected. I think the whole narrative around Cam Taylor-Britt was that he was a lot more locked in this offseason. Just to kind of peel back the curtain, I think he kind of took his foot off the gas in 2024. I think he was a bit content about where he was as a player, and that led to him being benched twice under Luna Rumo, and it wasn't a good season for him. Now he's in a contract year, and the whole talk in the offseason was, he's a lot more focused, and he's a lot more empowered in the scheme, and then he still laid an egg against the Cleveland Browns of all teams, right? So that's concerning, because Dax Hill, I think, is your number 1 cornerback for the Bengals defense. He's going to be in the slot. He's going to be on the outside. He can be moved all around. But I think if there is a big physical receiver, I would expect Cam Taylor-Britt to be against Brian Thomas Jr. in this game. And right now, I think Brian Thomas Jr. has the advantage there, because I just don't know where Taylor-Britt's head is at. I think he was just slow, indecisive in his movements and coverage, and he's just been really inconsistent over the past couple of years, and the whole messaging around him this offseason was that he was going to be a lot more locked in and focused, and that just hasn't happened yet. So that was a little bit surprising and disappointing to see in week 1, but it's just up to him to bounce back.
Why do you say that you expect him to cover Brian Thomas? Is there some shadow deployment that Golden uses on the defense, as opposed to just lining up cornerbacks on one side every snap, a la Richard Sherman, or even in Jacksonville, Tyson Campbell, I feel is almost always on one side of the field.
Yeah, like I said, you're not going to get cornerbacks just on one side of the field in this defense. So I would imagine that if there's going to be a more frequent matchup that you're going to see across the board, I would expect Dax to be on Travis Hunter because he's in the slot a lot more often. And I think the best matchup for the Bengals is still Cam Taylor-Britt against Brian Thomas Jr. just for size purposes. DJ Turner is still a really good man corner, but he's 5'10", 185 pounds, right? There's just an advantage for the Jags there overall. So I think this is going to be Taylor Britt's week to kind of go out head-to-head against Brian Thomas Jr. Maybe the Jags get creative and move him around a little bit and try to get him away from him. But I think if they watch the film, they won't be like, okay, we want our best receiver on Cam Taylor Britt until he proves it.
Gotcha. For week 2, what's like an under-the-radar player that Jaguars fans should know about entering the matchup, one on offense and one on defense?
Ooh, this is good.
It doesn't even have to be under the radar, honestly, just like basically not Joe Burrow or Jamar Chase, but like just an interesting player that you'll be keeping your eye on in this game on both sides.
I think on offense, like I said, their plan against the Browns was a little bit, I think, specific for what the Browns defense was, and you didn't see a lot of Mike Gesicki out there. He was essentially like the 4th receiver, 3rd tight end. I think you're going to see him a little bit more against Jacksonville as they kind of try to spread out the formations a little bit more, so I would expect him to have more than just the 3 targets that he had against the Browns. He's basically their pseudo 3rd receiver. He's going to be lined up in the slot more times than not, so I would expect to see him a little bit more often. And then on defense, Demetrius Knight Jr. had like 10 tackles in his debut at a pass defense, and he just kind of flies all around the field, and that was something that they desperately needed at linebacker this offseason. So I know the Jags have pretty good linebackers as well, but in terms of stopping Travis Etienne, who just couldn't be stopped last week, I think that'll be mostly on Demetrius Knight Jr.
Gotcha. Now, what's like a matchup that you're looking forward to this weekend? It can be like the Bengals passing offense versus the Jaguars passing defense, or a specific one-on-one matchup, or even like a coaching matchup. Just what's a key matchup that you're looking forward to unfolding on Sunday?
I think Jamar Chase is the little perturbed that he just didn't get his on Sunday, and it's always a tough job against Denzel Ward, but now he's going up against Tyson Campbell. I believe the last time that they played, Campbell didn't exactly have the best game, and that was with Jake Browning at quarterback, so I think he kind of feels like he needs to kind of bounce back, and I think Campbell is a pretty good man cover corner, but this is still Jamar Chase we're talking about, so I'm interested to see how he and Burrow kind of bounce back from last week's shit show.
I do think that Travis Hunter is going to get an increase in snaps. Liam Cohen said Wednesday that it's likely, and not just because the Bengals have an elite wide receiver duo in Chase and T. Higgins, but just because the Jaguars were planning on ramping up his snaps anyway. He played 9% of defensive snaps in week 1, for just 6 total, and he was a left cornerback on all of them. So I'll be interested to see how often he gets matched up with Jamar Chase specifically, but obviously he's going to have a decent amount of matchups against either him or T. Higgins. But like you're saying, I would expect Tyson Campbell to see most of Jamar Chase. Last question for you, John. Really appreciate your time again. But give me a final score prediction or any lingering thoughts that you have about this matchup.
Yeah, I think with the Bengals' first game, the whole narrative is about like slow starts and how can they avoid them. And I feel like thematically, the game was only going to go in 2 ways. The Bengals either look really good and lose, or they look really terrible and win. And of course, it was the latter there. So I think this game will not be 17-16 necessarily. I think the Jags have a much better offense than the Browns, and I think the Bengals have a little bit easier time scoring against the Jags than they did against the Browns. So I'm not going to say who wins and losses because I don't really like that prediction, but I will say I would imagine the over gets a little bit of action in this one. I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up being in the late 20s because the Bengals' run defense looks a lot more improved, but I really liked what I saw from Travis Etienne in that Jags offensive line that has a guy the Bengals know pretty well in Patrick McCarry in right guard. Ezra Cleveland's still a really athletic left guard, so that's going to be a tough challenge, I think, for this Bengals run defense and interior defensive line that is feeling pretty good about themselves, about how they handle Cleveland's run game, but I would imagine the Jags have a little bit more success there, and I'm really interested to see, like you said, how much Travis Hunter gets involved on both sides of the ball. Just one of the most fascinating players in the NFL today, and it'll be really interesting to see how much, like you said, he does go up against Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, and if he does well against those guys, it could be the difference in the game and lean it towards the Jaguars' favor.
Absolutely. Appreciate all your analysis, all of your insight. Unless you have any questions for me about the Jaguars or anything else to get off the chest, feel free to let the people know where they can find your work.
Yeah, man. All my work is at a2zsports.com/Cincinnati, and also doing YouTube channels, YouTube videos for the website as well, A to Z Sports Cincinnati. You can find my, I'll have a couple, maybe one Jaguars preview video at the end of this week, and then doing podcasts at the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast for the Believe in Podcast Network. I always love the Jaguars, though. Cat team brethren, right? Always another team that's
right.
Just trying to find itself. But Liam Cohen, definitely an exciting offensive mind. Trevor Lawrence is still fun when he's on, so it'll be a fun matchup.
Yeah, I feel like the past two matchups especially have been pretty notable. I mean, it's obviously unfortunate that Trevor Lawrence got hurt the last time when the Bengals visited Jacksonville, but up until that point, it was a really competitive game, and it was still kind of interesting to see the Jake Browning versus CJ Beathard show. And then, I mean, I guess the game itself in 2021 wasn't as interesting when the Jaguars traveled to Cincinnati, but obviously there was the infamous scandal with, or I don't know if scandal is really the right word, but the infamous actions that Urban Meyer took post game. So I think this will certainly be another good game. Certainly looking forward to it. John, thank you again so much for your time. Really
Thanks,
appreciate
Gus.
it. All right, that'll do it for this episode of Duval 22. You can catch us Monday, maybe Tuesday, probably Monday. I'll have a local Jaguars media member join me to break down Week 2 Jaguars at Bengals. But thanks again to John. Thanks to all of you guys for watching and listening. See you next time.